Today's reading comes from the 21st chapter of Luke, verses 5 through 19. This is a very interesting part of Luke's gospel. In fact, Barclay calls it one of the more difficult pieces of Luke's gospel to deal with. And I think to me it's one of the more interesting because of that. Jesus is teaching at the temple. And it says some people were talking about the temple. Luke 21, 5 to 19. How it was decorated with beautiful stones and ornaments dedicated to God. And Jesus said, as for the things that you are admiring, the time is coming when not even one of these stones will be left upon another. All of this will be demolished. The temple to God's people, Israel, was a very important symbol. It was the physical symbol of the presence of God. Now you got to remember, sometimes we think about this and we scoff at that because we talk about God being in spirit, being with us in all places. But you got to remember that this is a God who has made his presence known through visible things all throughout their history, trying to remind them of his presence. Doesn't justify what they did. It's just that I want you to kind of imagine that you remember the story of Moses encountering God in a visible image of a burning bush that didn't get consumed. I want you to remember the Exodus as the people followed the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud. The pillars that went before them as he led them through the wilderness. Visible signs of his presence. And so you also need to remember that as they went through the wilderness, they had the tabernacle. They would take it down, carry it with them, and put it up everywhere they went. When they were given the Ten Commandments, and later those were put into the Ark of the Covenant, all these visible signs that were evident to them and reminded them of God's presence. When the temple is finally built, that's what they look to as God's presence. That's where God resides. He's on our holy mountain in our holy city of Jerusalem. Right up there. And you can see this thing for miles and miles and miles. It's huge. Can you imagine 20 stories tall? Glistening bright white and gold. Imagine, whatever you can imagine and as beautiful as you can imagine it, probably pales in comparison to what you would have actually seen if you would have stood at a short distance and beheld this beauty. To the Jewish people, to hear that this would be demolished was something you couldn't even fathom. It's something that you dare not even consider because of all that it represented to you and your faith and your people and all that would be shattered at the loss of such a beautiful thing. I want to read to you what Josephus says about the temple. He said the pillars of the porches and the cloisters were columns of white marble, 40 feet high, each made of one single block of stone. Of all the ornaments, the most famous was the great vine made of solid gold, and it adorned the front of the temple. And he said each of those clusters of grapes was taller than a man. So when you can see when Jesus stands before the temple and he teaches that I am the vine and you are the branches and my Father is the gardener. Can you imagine how the people heard that, looking up at that temple and seeing that vine and knowing all that it represented in their faith and hearing him say those words? Can you imagine being in the presence of the temple? Josephus writes, the outward face of the temple in its front wanted for nothing that was likely to surprise either man's eyes or their minds. For it was all covered over with plates of gold of great weight. And at the first rising of the sun, it reflected back a very fiery splendor and made those who looked upon it turn away because it was as if you were looking into the sun itself. The temple appeared to strangers at a distance like a mountain covered with white snow. For whatever parts of it were not covered with gold were exceedingly white. Can you imagine the beauty of such a thing and what it meant to them? They took great pride in this temple. As I pondered this and what I was going to address in the sermon this morning, one of the things that came upon me was the curiosity to ask myself a question. Have I been like the Jewish people in my faith? Have I just given God parts of me and thought, that's enough? As long as I keep these things in order, then my relationship with Him is okay. Because to me, I'm not condemning them. I'm just saying that sometimes that's the way we look at things. They looked at that like, as long as the temple's good, we're good. We're good with God as long as it's there and as long as it's standing and as long as everything's taken care of there, no matter what's going on and how bad it gets, no matter how deceitful our leaders are and how corrupt, as long as the temple's there, we're good. Are we like that in our faith and our relationship with God sometimes? You know, as long as I'm in church every Sunday, as long as I'm tithing, as long as I'm doing this and this and this, then it's okay if I forget to love my neighbor. Yeah, you see what I'm saying there? We do that. We're human. We like to make trades. We like to justify what we do. Well, I want to stay mad at that person for a little longer. I'm not through being mad at them yet. I'm good on these three. You know, my temple is in place. Y'all with me? Yeah, well, we got to look in the mirror every now and then. That's not even the sermon today, but I just want you to think about that, okay? So Jesus is talking to them about the temple, and He says, guys, it's not going to be long. None of this is even going to be here. Full and total destruction. And sure enough, in AD 70, the Jews become so rebellious against Rome that finally Rome's had enough. And they go down, and Josephus writes that over 1.1 million people were killed and slaughtered, and another 100,000 were taken into captivity. And that temple was completely demolished. Everything in it was torn down. Not one stone left upon another. And in fact, it says you could draw a plow across the middle of it where the beautiful floors had been. And that's what Jesus is talking about there. They go on, and they say, Teacher, when will these things happen? What sign will show us that these things are about to happen? We're going to come back to that in a little bit. Hold that thought. But Jesus says to them, watch out that you're not deceived. Many will come in my name saying that I'm the one. It's time. Don't follow them, Jesus says. When you hear of wars and rebellions, don't be alarmed. These things must happen first. But the end won't happen immediately. Barclay says we need to remember that only when a man sees things through the eyes of God does he see them clearly. That's important. When they're asking, Lord, what sign will we have? Are y'all like that? I am. I was praying for a sign earlier this week. And you know me, I'm like, could you make it with Roman candles and a big flag and maybe a marching band so I won't miss it? Y'all don't do that, right? Y'all spend so much time in prayer that God could just drop the slightest hint and you would catch the sign, right? Okay, good, because that's what you should be. See, me, I'm always distracted and running and struggling to find time to stay in the presence of God. And that's what He wants. He wants our sincerity. He's not going to send the marching, well, sometimes He'll send the marching band down the street with the sign. But a lot of times, He wants us to be so sincere that we can't help but miss even the smallest answer to a prayer. Lord, what will the sign be that you would give to us that we'll know that these things are coming? And Jesus says, don't be deceived. Now, that's an important statement for us to consider, because if we're waiting on the marching band, if we're waiting on some grand, amazing sign, the chances are we will be deceived. The chances are that if somebody came breaking through that door right now hollering, Jesus is coming back, He's here now, He's right around the corner at the post office. There's some people who call themselves Christians that would jump up and run. I'm thinking it doesn't happen that way if I read my Bible right. So if we stay and study, we know that guy is one of these folks that Jesus was talking about. Don't believe them. Don't be deceived. But we need to stay and study. We need to stay in prayer. We need to stay as close to God's presence at all times as we can, so that when we do need a sign, it's discernible and we know where it came from. Don't be deceived. Jesus says, Nations and kingdoms will fight against each other, and there'll be great earthquakes and wide-scale food shortages and epidemics. There will also be terrifying sights and great signs in the sky. But before all this occurs, they will take you into custody, and they'll harass you because of your faith. And they'll hand you over to the synagogues and the prisons, and you'll be brought before kings and governors just because of my name. This will provide you with an opportunity to testify. Make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance. I'll give you words and wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to counter or contradict. You'll be betrayed by your parents, your brothers, your sisters, your relatives, and your friends. And they will execute some of you. And everyone will hate you because of my name. Still, not a hair on your head will be lost. By holding fast, you will gain your lives. By holding fast, you will gain your lives. When we hold fast to something that's dear and important to us, if you think about that term, it means that it cannot get away. Our grip does not slide or slip in any way. We can't be moved. When we hold fast our position, we can't be moved. No matter what's going on around us, we can stay our course. We can hold our position. We can hold on to the rope. Whatever it is that we're grasping and gripping, it is ours. And we don't yield. And that's what Jesus says about our faith. We're in a time, I was reading something here the other day. Do you know there are starting to spring up mega churches that are atheist in nature? For real. Google it. You'll find it. They come together and they celebrate the absence of God. They have bumper stickers and things that say, no God is more. Things like that. But they're actually gathering. And I don't know that you would call it worship because you have to have a deity to worship, I guess. But for whatever reason, they gather and they have discussions about how we're a people of good moral character. We don't need religion to cause us to be good people. You know, those are the ways that they celebrate. They are doing these things. They're springing up in the larger communities around our country and around the world. It began in England and in London, if I read it right. But currently you can find them in Omaha, and you can find them in Los Angeles and New York. And they're there. And see, this is just following up on the last 50 or 60 years or so. If you notice, the climate in our country has been to turn against Christianity. Calvin mentioned this recently in one of his papers on Sunday morning for the breakfast fellowship. You know, if you use Jesus' name in vain, nobody thinks twice about it. If you worship him out in public, people look at you cross-eyed like you got three heads. Seriously. There are places now, if you pause to ask a blessing over a meal in a restaurant, people boo you. Jesus says, hold fast. Stand firm in your faith. And then he says some things right before that that really amaze me. He said, don't worry about preparing your defense. When you suffer these persecutions, it gives you an opportunity to share your faith and testify to others. And there's a lot. If you go back and look at Josephus and some of the other historians from the first century, you'll find that there's lots of Christians who claim that they have no idea how they answered the charges that were brought against them, but they claim that Christ was there in their presence and gave them the words. And great things happened because of it. Because they did exactly what Jesus said. They stood firm in their faith, they held fast, and they trusted in him to give them the wisdom and the words to say to answer the charges before them. And through that, they were able to share their faith. And today, it's no different. There's a time coming. I'm not one of the doomsday preachers. I'm not preaching the end times, you know, get more bullets and more guns. That's no. Go to another church if you're waiting on that sermon, okay? But there's a time coming when it's going to be more and more difficult to stand up and say, yes, I'm a Christian. No longer will there be a place of honor for those people. Jesus says, hold firm. He reminds us of the times when he's told the disciples, when I'm lifted up, I'll draw all men to me. You do what I teach, I'll take care of the rest. And our trust and our faith is so very important. When will all these happen? I don't know. Some of it is happening in some places, even in our country today. Every day seems to be a little bit more of it. Maybe that's the way that it's headed. I don't know. Maybe it'll turn before it gets as bad as it could. I don't know. All I do know is what Jesus tells us here in his word. He says, if you hold fast and remember that every persecution is an opportunity to witness your faith. He says, I'll do great things because I'll give you the wisdom and I'll give you the words. This is awesome stuff in this chapter of Luke. It speaks to them 2,000 years ago. It still speaks to us and encourages us even today. Because it's through his Spirit that God does these things. And when we trust in him, we receive these great things. Do we not? And so, my question to us today, as we think about this, don't be deceived. You know, what sign is it that we're supposed to be looking for? What sign is it that we're supposed to be looking that these things are happening? Well, maybe it's a newspaper article. Maybe it's something we read on the internet. Maybe it's something we heard from a friend and how they were treated or what they went through. None of that really is as important as what Jesus teaches we should do. And that is to be prepared and don't be deceived. We fail when we're deceived. What are the signs we say? Jesus says, you know, the signs, they'll happen and you'll know. And there's not just any one given sign. But what I want you to remember is that if you stay in my presence, I'll deliver you through all those things and you won't be lost. By holding fast, you'll gain your life. And I'll give you the wisdom and I'll give you the words and great things will happen because of my name. That's what we need to remember about what are the signs. I mean, we see it, we hear it all the time. People talking about the end times and what's going to happen. Oh, you know, the wars in the Middle East, they're prophesied here and there and yonder. Yeah, they are. People want to get all tied up in, well, it's going to happen in 2014, somewhere in March, about the third week. Last time I checked, it said nobody knows. So as soon as I find one of them that starts narrowing down the date, I quit reading that one. See? Don't be deceived. Trust in God, and he'll deliver us through all these things. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.